cartoon illustrator John Samuel Pughe had a career lasting less than 20 years, but he was a remarkably prolific, highly skilled and popular satirist of his time. He was born in Wales in 1870, but he was brought to America by his immigrant parents when he was 2 years old. And in his teens he studied art at the Cooper Union in New York. Beyond that, very little is known about his life. In his early career he worked for a couple of newspapers, but no visual evidence has survived. But in 1894, at the age of 24, he began working for the satirical magazine Pughe, and not long after he arrived, the magazine became one of the first to make use of full-colour printing. So Pughe and his colleagues were now free to create colour illustrations directly onto paper for reproduction. But even with this newfound freedom, like many others of his generation, he continued to rely on his eloquent line work for the shading and modelling of his characters and backgrounds, and applied transparent washes of ink or watercolour so the line wouldn't be obscured. Some of Pughe's illustrations were complex crowd scenes, and his meticulous style and fine penwork rendered even the smallest, most insignificant character in expressive detail. He was also one of the most accomplished anthropomorphic illustrators of his time, and was able to give the animals he drew completely plausible human characteristics. Given that the only examples of his illustration that exist were exclusively for publication in Pughe, it's reasonably safe to assume he was employed as a staff artist there for the best part of his tragically short career. Unfortunately, ever since childhood, Pughe had suffered with persistent bad health, which only deteriorated in adulthood. His last cartoon was published in Pughe in 1908, and the following year he died at the age of only 38. What he might have achieved if he'd lived longer, we can only speculate. Helen Dryden was a highly successful and well-known American illustrator and an equally successful industrial designer, but sadly she's now perilously and mystifyingly close to forgotten. She was born in Baltimore in 1882, and she moved to Philadelphia with her family when she was 7 years old. In childhood she showed pronounced artistic ability and went on to study painting at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. But once she completed the course, she realised she was far more interested in fashion illustration. And after moving to New York in 1909, she spent a year trying to interest the many fashion magazines there in her drawings. But she was unsuccessful everywhere she went, including the prestigious Vogue magazine. But the following year there was a change of ownership at Vogue, and when the new editor saw Dryden's work, she was offered a contract that led to a 13-year collaboration from 1909 to 1922. During this time she produced many fashion illustrations for the magazine, and her fanciful decorative gouache paintings featured frequently on Vogue covers. And before long she was also commissioned by other titles such as Vanity Fair and House and Garden. By 1923, when her association with Vogue had ended, Dryden's earlier Art Nouveau-influenced approach to illustration had evolved into a far more radical and firmly geometric Art Deco style. The covers she created in this period for the Delineator magazine were a clear indication of this refinement of her approach, and any trace of the organic had been eradicated, and her images emulated what was happening in European illustration at the same time. Creatively restless and ambitious, in 1925, Dryden turned her attention to 3D design and soon had a parallel career producing Art Deco household items and furnishings. Unfortunately, the 1929 Wall Street crash put an end to many of Dryden's sources of income, and she was forced to get by with fewer commissions than previously. But in 1932, she changed direction again, and this time worked her way into automotive design, where she quickly built a reputation for the quality of her work. Between 1935 and 1938, she worked for Studebaker, designing car interiors, and she was one of the highest paid women in America at that time. By this point, Dryden had completely abandoned her career as an illustrator, which proved to be unwise, because her stint at Studebaker ended in 1938 and things went rapidly downhill from there. Nobody gives any reason why, but she never worked again, quickly ran out of money, and from the mid-50s to her death in 1972 had to live on welfare in New York. John Austen was an English illustrator who worked almost exclusively in black and white, and like several other of his contemporaries, he tends to be unfairly hidden in the shadow cast by the reputation of Aubrey Beardsley. Austen was born in 1886 in Kent, and he trained as a carpenter in his father's workshop, but left for London hoping to realise his artistic ambitions in 1906 at the age of 20. He attended a few life drawing classes, but essentially he was self-taught and relied on his natural talent to find work as an illustrator. How successful he was is anybody's guess, because I can only pick up the trail 15 years later with these low-resolution illustrations from the book The Little Ape, which was published in 1921. And the following year, Austen's illustrated edition of Shakespeare's Hamlet appeared, and was very favourably reviewed by the influential critics of the press. His intricate and sensitive line illustrations captured Shakespeare's dramatic tragedy with great authority, and they're considered some of his best work, even if the ghost of Beardsley is a fairly obvious presence. Austen was particularly prolific at this time, and his version of Charles Perrault's Tales of Past Times was also published in the same year. And as the 20s progressed, Austen's style was increasingly influenced by Art Deco, and any accusations of Austen being merely a Beardsley clone evaporated as his work evolved. This change of direction can be clearly seen in his work for Daphnis and Chloe, published in 1925. Although most of his output was monochrome, on occasion colour would be applied either as washes of watercolour or mechanically applied at printing. It's a guess on my part, but some looks uncannily similar to French pochoir stencil prints of the period. Some of his illustration in this period mimic the look of woodcuts, although they were created in pen and ink. But strangely, some really were woodcuts, and he was also known to use scraperboard. And with this armoury of techniques, Austen worked successfully throughout the 1920s, and there were many highlights, including Lord Byron's Don Juan in 1926, a very Art Deco version of Madame Bovary 2 years later, and a particularly medieval visualisation of Shakespeare's As You Like It in 1930. Following an illness in the early 30s, Austen returned to live in Kent, and from there he continued to publish illustrations, but at a much reduced volume. And one of his last projects was the comical series of woodcut illustrations for Aristophanes' ancient Greek play The Frogs in 1937. And John Austen died in Kent in 1948 at the age of 62. Herberto Carboni was one of Italy's most influential and durable poster artists and designers, but for most non-Italians he's an unknown quantity. Carboni was born in 1899 in Parma, and in his teens he studied at the Institute of Fine Art there. He graduated in 1921, and within a couple of years he'd succeeded in landing some regular clients, for whom he created advertising and magazine illustration. One of his earliest successes was with the series of posters he created for Oxo perfumes. These were manifestly Art Deco in style, but remarkably distinctive, with great use made of powerful and unorthodox combinations of colour. And after this high-profile series, clients were queuing up for similar posters and magazine covers, and even the occasional book. Among his many commissions for posters, Carboni created some dynamic graphics in support of Mussolini's fascist government. Whether this support was genuine or was merely lip service isn't known. Like Helen Dryden, Carboni was not one to be typecast, and in 1932 he moved to Milan, where he worked as a design consultant with Studio Borgheri, and his exhibition design in particular was in demand well into the 1960s. And to further emphasise the diverse nature of his talents, he enjoyed great success as a modernist furniture designer, none of which appears to have interfered with his ongoing poster work. Between the 20s and the 50s, he slowly but surely moved away from his own Italian take on Art Deco into an even more geometric modernist style, which pushed hard at the boundaries of what can even be called illustration, and the later work was incorporated into a stylish but severe design aesthetic. And Carboni continued juggling his various careers up to the end of the 1960s, at which point he began to concentrate on sculpture and painting, also with success, up to his death in Milan in 1984 at the age of 85. American cartoonist Vernon Grant is probably the least unknown of this group of illustrators, but that doesn't make him as well known as he should be. He was born in 1902 in South Dakota, and despite a talent for drawing, he studied business law in California. But at 21, Grant enrolled in the Art Institute of Chicago. And as with so many others, evidence of his early career is non-existent as far as I can tell, and the earliest dated work I could find is this cover of Judge magazine from 1932, when he would have already been 30 years old. Before long he would go on to create more for Judge and quite a few other magazines as his career progressed. And the following year he had a major breakthrough when he was commissioned to create the characters Snap, Crackle and Pop for Kellogg's Rice Krispies. And they were such an enormous commercial success, the company sent him on a world tour to promote their cereals a couple of years later, and his cheerful images were used extensively for their ad campaigns. Throughout the 30s and 40s, alongside his advertising work, Grant became one of America's most popular and prolific illustrators of fairy tales, and his Mother Goose images in particular heralded a more graphic, modernist direction than had been seen previously in traditional children's books. Grant used gouache or poster paint, generally applied opaque and flat, but he wasn't averse to adding some tonal detail from time to time, and he would frequently place his characters on flat black backgrounds, which gave them tremendous visual impact. He used this device with great success on quite a few of the covers he created for Collier's magazine, which became one of his most enduring professional relationships. During World War II, Grant travelled overseas entertaining troops with sketches and humorous talks, and he also found time to create some light-hearted propaganda material. After the war, he used the money he'd made to build a huge farm and ranch in South Carolina, and his success continued undiminished in the later years of his career, with significant commissions such as his series of playful covers for the Saturday Home magazine, most of which featured his cute female characters. And there were more books for children, many of them tied to commercial enterprise, and as much advertising work as he could handle. After a particularly long and successful career, Vernon Grant finally packed up his brushes in 1985, and he died in 1990 at the age of 88. Which takes us to the end of this video. I hope it's been worth your while, and I'll see you next time.